Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Creating Affirming Learning Environments webinar this morning. My name is Brittany. I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. As always, before we jump into our webinar, I do want to take care of a few housekeeping items. So you are aware, as participants, you are currently in listen-only mode. We will be taking time for questions and comments, so you can either put those in the questions or chat feature, or if you have a working microphone, you are welcome to use the raise hands feature, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question that way. This webinar is also being recorded and will be posted to the ICSPS website later this week for you to review or to share with colleagues or other interested parties as well. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Ruthie Moore for today's presentation.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today. My name is Ruthie Moore. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an inclusive schools educator for the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance. And if you can currently see my screen, you see that it says PHIMC. So PHIMC is the Public Health Institute of Metropolitan Chicago. And you will, in a couple more slides, find out how PHIMC and the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, or ISSA, how we are connected. Okay, so some of our learning objectives for today are to gain familiarity of the language and terminology used by LGBTQ+ youth, to build an understanding of common needs, barriers, protective factors, and to identify classroom strategies for creating more affirming learning environments. Now, currently during today's pandemic, the classroom obviously is not so much a physical space as it once was. And so throughout this presentation, when we refer to the idea of the classroom, we are talking about the environment that we as adults, as educators, as youth service providers are able to create for young people. And so I would be remiss if I did not talk about how the classroom as a physical space is such a support system and such a resource hub for young people. And without that physical space, how are we able to transition our practices? What does that look like? And so I do believe that we're all trying to figure this out together as people who work with young people. And so throughout today's presentation, I would like to keep the backdrop of the classroom as an environment and less of a physical space where we gather together. And if anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns throughout, please feel free to utilize the chat feature to interact and answer questions, and I will keep proceeding forward. So about PHIMC, so the Public Health Institute of Metropolitan Chicago, we enhance the capacity of public health and healthcare systems. And we do this throughout Illinois, and it is to promote health equity and expand access to services. So the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance. So the mission of the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, or ISSA, is to promote safety, support, and healthy development for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. So you probably heard me refer to it earlier as LGBTQ+, and that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. So we do this in the Illinois schools, communities, through advocacy, education, youth organizing, and research. So we're going to start off with a wonderful quote by Adrienne Rich. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that most good things start with a quote. And so that was a joke. I know I can't hear you laughing, but I will insert the laughter for myself. And so when someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. So try to think of a time when you realize that something that you have been taught in school or something that you have been taught by a loved one turned out not to be true. And so I can share a personal experience for myself when I started to study American history and I learned the story of Christopher Columbus from a vastly different perspective from what I had been taught throughout elementary school. And so I experienced psychic disequilibrium because I could not believe that I had been taught something one way when there was a whole different perspective on it. And so try to think of a time in your life when that has happened. And so we have to be mindful that as adults that work with young people, we have so much power over them to shape how they view the world. So personal belief versus professional responsibility. So I like to say that you can believe whatever you want to believe. Like that is fine. That is that I mean that's life. And so the question is, where is the line between your personal belief and your professional responsibility? So in order to explore that, we want to think about, well, what is my professional responsibility? Well, it's the expectations of your work environment. So what are the expectations of your work environment? Do you accept those expectations? And once you accept those expectations, recognize that code switching might occur between the home environment and the school environment. And we are referring to code switching, meaning that code switching is generally thought of in a racialized context. And it's oftentimes referred to, for example, when an African American or Black kid supposedly talks white at one way and they could talk Black in another way. And so that's an example of code switching in a racialized context. In this context, we're talking about code switching, meaning the concept that someone might be quote unquote out of the closet, quote unquote, in a home environment, and in a work environment, they might not. And this also goes for your colleagues as well as young people. So some of your colleagues might be out in their personal lives, but in their professional setting, they are not. And so this is a form of code switching. There's nothing wrong with code switching. The point is to recognize that this might occur. Some young people feel okay about being out at school versus being out at home and vice versa. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how young people sometimes code switch related to their identities. Okay, so the importance of language. So be intentional about the language that you use. Engage your students in conversations around the evolution of identity-based language, especially when especially when introducing primary source material. And so we will get more into terminology and language as we proceed throughout the PD. And I would also encourage you to take photos or screenshots of any of these slides that you might want to explore later, or maybe Google some of the terminology. And so that's something that is very helpful. So reflect and share. So what are your identities and how do they impact the conversation? So if you are in the mood to utilize the chat feature, what are some of your identities? So you might say, I'm an educator, I'm a cat lover, I'm a mom, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm a Muslim, I am a chef, I'm a Christian, I am Jewish. So what are your identities? And when we say how do they impact the conversation, we are talking about the conversation now surrounding LGBTQ plus issues. So what are your connections to some LGBTQ plus issues? You might have a family member who identifies as LGBTQ. You might have participated in some activism work yourself. So what are your connections to LGBTQ plus identities? And we'll talk more about intersecting identities and how you can hold multiple identities at one time, and how young people hold multiple identities at one time, and how these identities are ever changing. Let me just make sure we don't have any questions, comments, concerns, none seen. Okay, I will keep moving. So sexuality and gender identity are independent of one another. So what does that mean? So now we are going to start exploring some of the terminology. And so sexual orientation. So this is, who are you attracted to? Who do you want to take to the movies once the world open back up? Who makes your heart flutter? That is your sexual orientation. Gender identity. This is how you understand your own gender. And gender expression. This refers to how you outwardly express your gender, how you walk, how you talk. And we will have some examples of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in some subsequent slides. So just when we say that sexuality and gender identity are independent of one another, we say that because someone who is assigned male at birth, their gender identity could be a girl. And if they are attracted to a man, then technically they are heterosexual. Okay, I'll give you another example. Someone who was assigned male at birth, they identify, or their gender identity is a girl, and their sexual orientation or who they're attracted to is a woman, then this person is considered to be lesbian or queer. So I'll give you one more example of how sexuality and gender identity are independent. Someone who was assigned male at birth, who identifies their gender identity is a boy, they are attracted to, meaning their sexual orientation is to men. This person would be considered to be gay or queer. So once we show the actual examples of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, we will have a better understanding of how sexuality and gender identity are independent of one another. So identity formation. So the average coming out age in 1991 was about 25. And when we say coming out, that is short for quote unquote coming out of the closet, meaning that you are able to openly express your identity to the world. So back in 1991, that was 25 years old. Today, currently, that is between 13 and 14 years old. So in the chat, why do y'all think the average coming out age has gone down for young people? So some of the reasons could be related to more acceptance. It could also be related to more access to information. What is the role of technology? And so gender identity is thought to be established between the ages of 2 and 5. And sexual orientation is thought to be established between the ages of 9 and 10. And remember, we said gender identity is how you understand your own gender, and your sexual orientation is who makes your heart flutter. And so gender identity is thought to be established between 2 and 5, and sexual orientation is thought to be established between the ages of 9 and 10. So for most individuals, gender is about the interrelationship of 3 things. And what are those 3 things? Those 3 things are sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and gender expression. So sex assigned at birth. So this is the classification of one's sex at birth based on anatomy. So we have male, female, or intersex. This is also known as assigned sex, natal sex, or gender assignment. And again, we'll have some examples of that of sex assigned at birth. So gender identity, remember, this is a person's internal, deeply felt sense of being a man, woman, both, or neither. And gender identity, remember, between the ages of 2 and 5 is when we generally establish that. And so gender expression, how we outwardly express our gender through our dress, behavior, mannerisms, hairstyle, etc. These can be perceived as masculine or feminine and or both or neutral. And so when we think about gender, we used to think of gender on the binary, and we'll talk more about the binary gender system, but binary meaning 2, this or that. So male or female is how we classify gender. But gender is thought to be the interrelationship of these 3 things: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, and gender expression. So gender identity is not determined by genitals or sex assigned at birth. So your gender identity, remember, that is your internal, deeply felt sense of being a man, woman, both, or neither, is not determined by genitals or your sex assigned at birth. So, gender identity, transgender / trans is an umbrella term that is used to describe people whose gender expression does not conform to cultural norms and or whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. So transgender is a self-identity, and some gender nonconforming people do not identify with this term. So because transgender is a self-identity, that means that neither you nor I nor anybody except for the person who is the self can identify as transgender or trans. So cisgender or cis. So this is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth and is considered to be a privileged identity. So cis, the scientific, it means on the same side as. So when you were born, your sex assigned at birth was female, and you grew up to identify as a woman, then you have a cisgendered gender identity. And so why do you think that cisgendered is considered to be a privileged identity? Well, because because of the way that the term cisgender is equated with the norm. And so that is why there's privilege associated with it, because it is It is quote unquote the norm. And so that is why cisgender is a privileged identity. And so right here for this lovely picture, it says gender is less about this, meaning the binary of male and female, and more like the graphic on the bottom. So gender expansive refers to the wider, more flexible range of gender identities or expressions than those in the binary system. And so gender expansive is also referred to as gender nonconforming, gender creative. And so when we think of gender expansive, think of anything outside of the binary gender system, male, female. So non-binary. So this is an umbrella term that reflects gender identities that don't fit within the expected binary, male and female. So some of these might be gender queer, gender fluid, agender. And we will have more examples of gender identities in a nifty chart coming up very soon. So what is a transition? So when we saw the word transgender before, what exactly is a transition? So this is a legal, social, and medical term. And so when we think of a transition, we think of it in three different parts: socially, medically, legally. So social is name, pronoun, accessing bathroom facilities based on your gender identity. Those are social transitions. Some medical transitions are seeking gender affirming care, which may or may not include hormone therapy or surgical treatments. Legal is changing one's gender marker on driver's license, passports, birth certificates, things like that. Most young people start their transitions where? Where do y'all think most young people start their transitions? Okay, thank you for your participation. Absolutely, you're right. Most of them start socially. So most young people start their transitions socially. And also related to medical and legal, let's talk about if anybody has ever had to change a legal document, then you know that costs money, it costs time. And so there is some privilege associated with legal transition, as well as when we think of medical transition, think of the role of insurance and how insurance affects medical transitions, meaning that sometimes some people who undergo transitions don't change their gender markers on their legal documents because they need to access certain types of medical care. And the way that insurance works is that you have to have certain gender markers in order to access certain care. So if you were a trans man that still had internal reproductive parts, then you likely would also need to access medical care based on those internal reproductive parts. And so transitions are very complicated. And these three different parts in this Venn diagram really show how they overlap each other. So here are some of the examples that I've been telling you are going to come up. So I would encourage you to snap any photos of any of these words that you want to look up. Do you recognize any of them? Are any of these words new to you? Now, terminology and language are very important, but it is not the end all be all of engaging with issues surrounding LGBTQ. And oftentimes we live in such a gotcha culture that nobody wants to say the wrong thing. And so, in order not to say the wrong thing, sometimes we would rather just not say anything at all instead of being caught in a gotcha moment. And so, hopefully, today's presentation will make it easier to be able to feel more comfortable with terminology and language. So, for some sex assigned at birth, we have female, male, intersex, and intersex is a socially constructed category reflecting biological variation. So it's a general term that refers to a variety of conditions where someone who is born with sexual anatomy, they don't seem to understand, or it isn't understood, it doesn't fit within the male or female definition of sexual anatomy. And so that's how we refer to intersex. When we see something like AMAB, that is assigned male at birth, and that could be because there was an intersex assignment that could have been assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. But also you see designated, and so designated female at birth or designated male at birth. Now, when we think of some gender identities, we have agender, bigender, cisgender, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, man, boy, male. So some of these you recognize, some of them you might not. When we see something like genderqueer, genderqueer is someone who sees themselves as beyond a man or woman, beyond the binary gender system. And gender nonconforming is someone who doesn't adhere to or protest the rules and norms of dressing, behavior, activity assigned to someone based on their sex. And of course, transgender is sometimes referred to as trans for short. Someone may have changed themselves through their clothing, appearance, their name, their body. We will talk a little bit more about two-spirit later on. When we think of gender expression, remember that is how you express your gender. And we have androgynous, butch, femme, fluid. And so androgynous is not distinctively masculine or feminine in dress, appearance, identity, or behavior. Butch, this is intentionally masculine. And you can have any sexual orientation and be considered to be butch. So when we see the word femme, so femme is intentionally feminine in appearance, behavior, dress, identity, and sexual attitude. So sexual orientation, remember, this is who makes your heart flutter. Who's your bae? So some sexual orientations, we have asexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, pansexual. So bisexual meaning bi, remember two, meaning that you are attracted to more than one gender. So queer is a broader term. Sometimes it's an umbrella term for anything other than heterosexual. Sexual orientation could also be heterosexual. We have pansexual, and this is you are attracted to others. And there's a lot of gender fluidity behind pansexualism. So we have questioning. Questioning is an identity that makes space for people who just don't know. And so that is questioning. That is the Q. in LGBTQ. Okay. Any questions, comments, or concerns thus far? Okay. We are halfway through our PD. So, intersecting identities. So, at the beginning, I asked y'all to think about some of your identities and reflect on those. And then I said, well, what is the connection to LGBTQ plus issues based on your identity? So when we think of intersecting identities, also some terms are culturally specific and they encompass both racial and ethnic identity and sexual orientation and or gender identity at the same time. So for example, the term Latinx. So this is the gender neutral umbrella term as opposed to Latino or Latina, or even Latin, Latinx, Two-Spirit. So this is a Native American umbrella term that encompasses sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And people who have both masculine and feminine spirits are considered to be two-spirits. So stud or AG, meaning aggressive, is a term used predominantly to describe a Black masculine lesbian, but also is used by other people of color to describe a masculine lesbian. So Affirming is from the Samoan culture, and it is someone who was assigned male at birth, and they embody both masculine and feminine traits. Hijra is an Indian term, and it is for intersex people or transgender women, and it is of the Inuit Indian culture. So race and ethnic identity and sexual orientation make up people's identities, and there are a lot of intersecting points related to identities. And remember, people code switch, and so think about the connection between code switching racially and code switching related to your identity. Okay. I'm going to pause again for questions, comments, or concerns. Okay. Moving right along. So the importance of language. So when we think of gender specific language versus gender neutral language, there are some words that we can switch up. And so when we say mom or dad, the gender neutral version of that is parents. And one reason why I like to always try to use gender neutral language as much as possible with young people is because sometimes not all young people, they might not live with their parents. Some of them might be in foster care, or some of them might live with other relatives or friends of the family. So sister, brother, you could say siblings. One of my favorites off of here is the gender neutral term for niece or nephew, and that is nibblings or nibs. I had never heard that. When we say boyfriend or girlfriend, just change it to boo or bae. or date or partner. An example is when I first started to do these presentations for creating affirming learning environments for the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance. I would always say you guys to refer to the group of people that I was presenting to. And so it was just a habit of how I would refer to a group. And so now I've changed you guys to y'all. And with young people, you know, you can always say students, friends, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so's class. You say class. And so a couple more examples. Instead of ladies and gentlemen or boys and girls, you could say honored guests, distinguished guests, or just hey y'all. That's just one of my favorites to say. And so language is very important. It does take practice to sometimes have to retrain your brain, but it is worth the extra effort. So in terms of when we are inside of the classroom, and you know, we're thinking of our classroom as not so much a physical space, but the environment that we create for our young people. So in terms of curricular practices, a lot of gendered practices have root in classroom management, from my experience, from what I can kind of ascertain. So one little nice nifty chart for documenting or just kind of seeing about your practice is to take your practice. The example here is boys and girls line up, and this is the gender practice. So you can ask yourself, is there a pedagogical function to this? Is there a classroom management function to this? So if it's classroom management, can you replace it with something that's gender neutral? Can you? Yes, you probably can. If not, get rid of it. So if there is a pedagogical function, am I doing this because, you know, if yes, can you explain it? Keep it. If you cannot explain it, get rid of it. So instead of boys and girls line up here, we can have our young people to line up based on who likes hot dogs or hamburgers, or who likes the Cubs versus the White Sox, or the St. Louis Cardinals versus the Cubs. And so classroom management practices in some instances trump any type of gender affirming curricular and educational practices in our mind, because, you know, classroom management is a huge function of being around young people. And so when we think of classroom management in today's sense, in, you know, doing e-learning and other digital ways to connect with young people, how do we transition our practices to be gender affirming in a digital space? And so this, we'll talk more about pronouns, but this could be something as simple as having your pronouns, mine are she, her, displayed next to your name during digital meetings and presentations. So let me refer to our lovely clip art here. So we have the spork doesn't know which bathroom to use, because the bathrooms are for spoons and forks. So where does the spork go to the restroom? And in our PD later today, we will talk more about accessing restroom facilities. So what are you supposed to do? The first thing is to meet your young people where they are. So we know young people are continually developing attitudes and their identities, and this is based on their environment. Only a small fraction of that is school. We also have to think about home life and how young people develop their attitudes and identities based on that. We also want to focus on the idea that all people have individual likes and dislikes. And this could also be brought back to your personal beliefs versus your professional responsibility. So people have individual likes and dislikes, and some of that is based on their personal beliefs. So exemplify by using differences and similarities between you and your students. So what are some things that y'all have in common? What are some differences? Gently challenge stereotypes / binary thinking with concrete counter examples. And so how do we do that? So one curricular exercise that I like to do with young people is to introduce word etymology and the history of words and language. And so we talk about what are some words and how has the meanings of those words changed over time. And so when we gently challenge stereotypes, the key word is gently, because we want to always be cognizant that we have to meet our young people where they are, and also know that people have individual likes and dislikes. And the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, we are also developing a PD webinar for the inclusive curriculum law that was passed by Governor Pritzker last year that's being implemented this year. And so that's just a shameless plug for that. So the importance of language. When we think about pronouns, gender pronouns, I told you that my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so what are your pronouns? So some examples of gender pronouns could be she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs, the, zer, hers. Now, when we think of gender pronouns, it is important to note that somebody's gender pronouns can change. Young people oftentimes change their pronouns until they figure out, what they want their pronouns to be. So when we think of pronouns, have y'all seen people use pronouns in something like email signatures? I see that pretty often. When somebody takes the time to tell you what their pronoun is, it should be respected. It's not easy to communicate with people what you want your pronouns to be. So sometimes that takes practice. And if you have a particularly difficult name to pronounce and you always have to correct people and tell them how to pronounce your name, then you know that that's not an easy thing to do all the time. And so when we work with the young people, we always want to make things as easy and as possible for them. And so as adults, when we introduce ourselves with our pronouns, then that is oftentimes an indication to a young person that, okay, I can introduce myself with my pronouns also. And we use gender neutral pronouns all the time without thinking about it. So for example, if somebody left a phone on a desk, you would pick it up and say, who left their phone? Who didn't grab their phone? Because you don't know whose it is. And so we use gender neutral pronouns. So in terms of how do you know what pronouns young people want to use? So again, one way to do that is to introduce yourself with your pronouns, and hopefully they will introduce themselves back with theirs. You model the behavior for them. But also, it's a good practice to collect demographic information from young people at the start of the school year. And there are also some pronoun activities that you can do with young people. And that is just an English lesson, as that, and that's, we do have that lesson available in our inclusive curriculum law PD. And so the last thing that I will say about pronouns is that pronouns are important to people. People should be called what they want to be called. And so that is why language is so important. So again, when we think of the differences between gender specific language and gender neutral language, it takes practice to kind of retrain our brains. If you speak a foreign language, or if you're learning a foreign language, then you know the older that we get, the harder it is for us to learn language. And I want to emphasize that knowing language and terminology can help a conversation, but it is not the end all be all of engaging in a conversation. So don't be afraid to engage in language and terminology that you might not know. So quick tips and practice. So you should not inform a parent or guardian of their child's LGBTQ plus identity without the child's consent. And we will talk more about this when we get into the legal rights and supporting transgender students PDs. But when we say you should not inform a parent or guardian of their child's identity without the student's consent, sometimes when you work with younger children, there has to be more of a collective support surrounding that young person. And so in these instances, you want to have your team, a solid team together, your social workers, your school counselors, your administrators, your teachers. Also, elements of a student's transition may be site specific. And remember, we talked about code switching earlier. So this is similar to site specific, meaning that a young person might be one way in around this group of peers and another way around another group of peers. And so we talked about a transition as being medical, legal, and social. And so if a young person's transition right now is site specific, they might use their gender pronoun actively in one setting and not use their gender pronoun in another setting. So you also want to affirm young people's resilience and creativity when they navigate systematic barriers. And so when we have our PD later today, we'll talk more about the systematic barriers that LGBTQ plus young people face, such as health barriers, things like that. So the last quick tip and practice is that show that you are a safe person to talk to by having your practice reflect your knowledge. And so engaging in conversations is a great curricular exercise, just having conversations with young people. These are some additional resources. And the next slide is a survey. If you have any feedback that you would like to share about the Creating Affirming Learning Environments webinar, please take note of the above web address. It is a tiny URL. And CALE, that stands for Creating Affirming Learning Environments 0527. It's a very quick evaluation. If you have any feedback, it is completely anonymous. And also, please visit our website for additional resources. And I will click on the last slide and exit out for any questions, comments, or concerns. Okay, so the only comment I see right now is that tomorrow, today and tomorrow, there are more PDs. So hopefully you have enjoyed this wonderful PD. And Brittany, I think I heard your audio come back in.
Yes, so we did have some questions pop through the questions box. And one is about the survey and the resource link. So we will include the link to the survey. I'll have Ruthie send me that, and we will include the link. As participants, you will get an email thanking you for participating, and we'll include that link in there as well. And if Ruthie is okay with it, we can also include a PDF version of the presentation from today as a resource for all of the participants as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I actually do. Okay, so you know what? While I was sharing, I could not see these questions. So would you like me to answer these questions? Would that be helpful?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first one I see is, what is the purpose of pronouns? So the purpose of pronouns is to allow people to be identified how they want to be identified. And so sometimes if we are a cisgendered person, and we say my pronouns, if I was born a woman and my pronouns are she, her, then that's oftentimes quote unquote the norm. That's easy. That's an easy one. But what if I was born a woman, but I identify as a man and I want my pronouns to be he or him? Physically, when you look at me, you would assume that my pronouns would be she, her. And so that's the purpose of pronouns, is for the situations that are not readily identifiable. People use their pronouns so that you can know, so that they're not quote unquote misgendered. And let me see if I see any others. Someone else experiences this. I saw something with the audio, the was quick, show the survey link. Okay, I don't think I see any more. Am I missing any of the questions, Brittany?
So I did have a question come through asking just a little bit more of an explanation on the gender identities and the different terminologies. And again, I think that as participants, if there are some that are unclear, if you want to Google them and look them up. That's a wonderful way of doing that as well. And like I said, Ruthie will share the PowerPoint with us, and then that, I'm losing my words here, that box with all of the terminologies will be in there as well for you to use and research also.
Yes. Okay, and thank you to everyone that participated in the chat. And I look forward to our 1 o'clock. And our 1 o'clock presentation does have some parts for self-reflection. And so if you just want to have a notebook and a piece of paper, or even just a Word document open, that would be very helpful.
All right, Ruthie. Well, thank you very much. And yes, both part 2 and part 1 registrations are both in the chat. And I believe you should have received a media blast from ICSPS with some upcoming PD that also has the registrations in there as well. So hopefully everyone is able to join us again this afternoon. Ruthie will be sharing some great information again, and thank you all so much for participating and joining us this morning.